Welcome to another broadcast of the American and Christian Truth News Network broadcast. Please subscribe, like, and share.
Welcome again to the American and Christian Truth News Network. I'm Tony Franklin, your host on the Franklin News Angle. And this is a news network whereby we discuss things that affect us as American citizens dealing with politics, entertainment, religion, and societal issues that affect us every day where we may not be gaining the truth on these issues. Why is America becoming such a violent nation? Why are our political leaders actually spurring violence as well as the mainstream media? What has happened in our past history as a nation when it comes to violence? And what are some of the things that we need to look at today in order to correct this path that America has been labeled as a violent nation? These are some of the things that we're going to tackle today on the American and Christian Truth News Network. When we look at all of the acts of violence that has taken place in our nation right now, the murders that are going on, the looting that is going on in a lot of our major cities, and all of the continual acts of violence that is bringing chaos into many of our cities across this nation, as well as escalating violence. American leaders in mainstream media are actually ignoring and, in a lot of instances, encouraging the issues that are fueling racial hatred and violence in our communities and across our nation. Now, passing new gun control laws and labeling former President Donald Trump and other conservatives, white and black, inspires acts of terrorism, and calling them white nationalists is actually a waste of time. This will not address the root causes of anger and disaffection that fuel recent acts of violence against racial, political, and religious minorities. This issue is far more complicated than our leaders and even the mainstream media have been able to grasp. This is evidenced by the reckless accusations and misguided approaches that many of them have made while sowing seeds of division in our nation. It is our leaders and the mainstream media and their inability to lead and to give factual news that places our nation at its greatest risk. Now, both political parties ignore the most important issues going on in our nation. These issues, largely ignored by clueless mainstream politicians of both parties, include liberal immigration policies that were rapidly changing our nation's demographic makeup, reduced job opportunities for low skilled, low wage workers because of structural changes in our economy, anger over racial and ethnic preferences, and indisputably high black on white violent crime rates that have been over exaggerated by the media. Contributing factors include the rapid growth of the internet, a big factor, allowing like minded people to find each other, and radical movement literature written to inspire acts of violence in our country. Most surprising was how the language and rhetoric of multiculturalism and identity politics furnished the intellectual underpinning for young whites to think in terms of white identity and white consciousness. Salient to these young whites was the perceived unfairness of racial double standards that permeated campus life, where constant reminders of their privilege was hammered into them. Now, in such an environment, white anger and grievance have grown. White morality and morbidity rates are rising. If there is an increase in violence from young whites, it is most likely a reaction to a society where political leaders seem hell bent on providing more opportunities to non Americans than to legit US citizens. Political correctness has run amok. And for what ultimate worthy purpose has that happened? America's failure and reluctance to reform immigration, accompanied by the intolerance and marginalization of anyone who demands enforcement of the laws, where police departments have been defunded by political leaders across our nation, accompanied by the intolerance and marginalization of anyone who demands enforcement of any of our city's laws. It creates a situation where some Americans are poised to strike out against perceived enemies. White Americans face a new reality that generates fear and anxiety. Echoes of this can be seen across our nation in many different circumstances and situations. Princeton economists Ann Caso and Angus Deaton have documented rising mortality rates amongst whites and clear early deaths of whites from preventable causes such as drug abuse, alcoholism, and suicide. Deaths of despair is the language Case and Deaton adopted. Despair comes from a sense of hopelessness. And the mainstream media and leftist politicians are focused intensely on white supremacists and white nationalism, while neither of that is really true at all. It is an obsession, yet a ploy. Meanwhile, they ignore acts of violence committed by racial minorities. So nothing is done to solve or even acknowledge this rising problem of violence in America. Democrats in Washington actually exploit tragedies and engage in name calling without addressing the core problem right now that have nurtured racial hatred and mistrust, not confined to just one group of Americans. If our leaders want to improve conditions in America, then they must begin to listen to the voices of all the people and not use the suffering of any one group of people in our America. And that includes working class whites as a means to score political points, to undermine our cultures, our societies, and induce and encourage violence across our nation through misguided news reports given by mainstream media and politicians who seek to score political points, further dividing our nation. If we want to end violence and create a great society in our nation, which we have always been, we must give each other permission to speak. So, in lieu of what we've just discussed in terms of some of the things that could be spurring violence in our nation, misinformation by mainstream media, politicians who are more concerned on both parties with scoring political points without really addressing the main issues that are causing violence in our nation. Let's look at some things that have occurred in our violent past, as well as what we can do or what we can consider as American citizens to curb this destructive violence that is occurring in most of our nations, because it is obvious that the mainstream media and politicians are really not focused on root cause of violence in our communities. Well, violence begets violence, and it is actually contagious. America is definitely a nation plagued by violence right now, in our homes, in our schools, in our streets, and in our affairs of state, both foreign and domestic. Violence permeates the entertainment culture with its glamorization of death and destructions and demonic movies in our movies and video games. Indeed, you all, it is estimated that by the time our children reach 18 years old, he or she will have witnessed 200,000 acts of violence and will have witnessed 40,000 murders on television. Our nation has one of the highest murder rates and levels of incarceration of all industrialized nations in the world. We even export violence, with one of our country's most profitable exports being weapons. All too often, these same weapons that we export fall into the hands of our enemies. Look at what has happened in the situation in Afghanistan over the past several months, where $80 billion of our most technological military equipment was left behind by this current administration. All too often, these same weapons fall into the hands of our enemies and are then used against us as a nation. America is now seen as a violent empire by many other nations, with continual wars that stretch back to at least the beginning of the 20th century. Now, but why is America so violent? Well, starting with the genocide practice against millions of Native Americans and continuing throughout the era of Black slavery, the Civil War, and onward to the present day conflicts in the Middle East, our nation's collective history has been indubitably stained with blood. America's history, which few have knowledge of, is not about memorizing dates by understanding what happened in the past and how to deal with what has happened in the past. But we have yet to truly come to terms with or to make amendments of these past acts of destruction and violence that we actually as a nation have caused, not only in our nation, but in other nations abroad. The truth is that we have got to deal with our problems, or they'll keep haunting us in our communities, in our homes, in our policies. America needs an exorcism of its past, as well as an exorcism of a lot of its political and media constituents. Some suggest that this failure to resolve our violent past has predisposed us to continuing along other path of violence. Others point the finger at a proliferation of weapons, increasing impersonal technologies, and desperate distribution of wealth, materialism, the erosion of our families, isolationism, and so on. Now, certainly, these are factors to look at and consider, but in the words of a Russian writer, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, we have forgotten God in the equation. A basic premise in the founding of our nation was that human beings were created by God. People as such were seen as special in the eyes of God, and life was considered precious in the eyes of our Heavenly Father. People as such were not only seen as precious, but life, unborn babies were also considered precious. However, this view of God and ourselves is increasingly being set aside and pushed aside, not only by mainstream media, but by politicians as well. I often hear America referred to as a Christian nation. Yet, while we might have a large number of churches in us that are professed Christians and people who profess that we believe in God, this is basically as far as it goes in a lot of situations. And at the end of the day, it is our actions that speak for us. And when you look at the actions of our nation, over 62 million of our children have been aborted. Violence continues to spur in our cities. Politicians have removed God's name and are continually trying to eliminate the name of God out of all of our cities. The mainstream media, who does not tell the truth in terms of what's going on truly in our nation. And at the end of this day, like I said, it is our actions that speak louder than our words. And our actions show us to be a nation that is continually lacking and spiraling in spirituality, morality, compassion, and community. Now, these values are neither practiced nor taught hardly anymore. There is no such thing as a right or wrong because there is no categories anymore. Wrong is being portrayed as right, and right is being portrayed as wrong by many of our leaders and mainstream media. Community is a spiritual thing, and we've largely lost that as well. We've become isolationists, caught up in our own private world where no one communicates. We turn away from the homeless, the suffering, and those in pain and in need, which our Father encouraged us to be a large part of, to be considered to be loving and to be kind and caring for our homeless and for those in need. The parable of the Good Samaritan was not merely a Sunday school lesson about helping others. It was a reminder that community is an integral part to a healthy spiritual life in our nation. The American community that was once bound together have been shattered. The loving relationship between parent and child is now separated by mom and dad's continual work environment to where we work tremendously and are not able to give that proper family time to our youth. And it is separated by cell phones and computers and the maniacal attachment to a cell phone. More and more, our children grow up living out of a suitcase, shattered between households of divorced parents. And the watchful, caring eye of a parent or neighbor have been shelled for youth online communities where teens don't have to learn or deal with the difficulties of real life face-to-face relationships. Materialism has eclipsed both spiritually and community, stripping us of the very things that once gave our lives meaning and worth in our communities and across our nation. As Holocaust survivor and psychologist Viktor Frankl has pointed out, people have enough to live by without having nothing to live for. They have the means, but no meaning. We have lost our moral compass in this nation, and it's destroying us as a country, as a community, as neighborhoods, and as individuals. The majority of Americans today, especially the younger generation, have no sense of what is right and what is wrong. It can be seen throughout our society, from the kids killing homeless people and the abuse going on in the streets by young gang members, to the current surges of violence that is being seen on games that is being perpetuated to our young kids. Having traded our spiritual values for a bowl of materialistic porridge, we have failed to impart meaningful lessons to our children about what is right and what is wrong. To borrow from Shakespeare, the fault is not in our stars, but the fault is in ourselves. The problem lies within us, in our communities, in our families. Our growing isolation from one another due to social media, and our lack of spirituality and values, not only in our homes and in our communities, but across our nation as a whole. If you and I are to reverse the tide of violence in this America, the principles of nonviolence must be taught in our homes. We have got to make more time for family. It must be taught in our churches by our pastors, in our schools, and in our communities. However, we remain a society that is armed to the teeth. Our culture glorifies violence. Even security guards at shopping malls now carry weapons. Our government is especially guilty of using violence as a quick fix. How can we teach nonviolence if our government leaders subscribe and induce and perpetuate violence by labeling individuals in our communities and in our society? Unless something dramatically changes, people, America's future is definitely continual violence. The answer doesn't lie in gun control or stigmatism of individuals or racial groups being targeted by mainstream media and political leaders to score points, nor is it a metal detector in our schools. We have got to change the way we think about and relate to one another as individuals. It is time to get our children away from the headphones, the cell phones. Get parents away from the cell phones. Stop hiding behind technology. Stop hiding behind isolism. Stop listening to the mainstream lies of the media and politicians who wish to isolate us away from each other. Because when you divide, you conquer. And the key to restoring civilness in our America is to once again become human again. And this is the Franklin News Angle for today. Thank you for joining me. We look forward to seeing you again on our next episode of the American and Christian Truth News Network.
Thanks for joining us on the Franklin News Angle. Join us every Tuesday and Friday on the American and Christian Truth News Network. Please subscribe, like, and share so you can get the latest in our Truth News broadcast. Goodbye, and God bless America.